Hello and welcome to MIP TV, and with me today is the fabulous Bob Cook, the polymath of anything psychotherapeutic, and we've got a real interesting book here. A person I've got a real interest in, Heinz Kohut, and the self-psychology movement, and the book is called The Theory and Practice of Self-Psychology. It's not written by Kohut, but it's written by M. Taggart White, Marcella Banks Weiner, and it was written about 4 years after he's died. I think we kind of worked that out, didn't we?
86.
86.
Kohut died in 82. And in fact, Kohut was one of the geniuses of the last century. And of course, you go back to this century with Freud and, Jung and people. But Kohut was one of the started his life as a psychoanalyst. He's probably, I would think, he might have been the first psychoanalyst to leave the actual couch and work with people actually face to face in terms of the chairs. And he created, he created the self-psychology movement in the USA, and really broke from the psychoanalytical ranks, the classical psychoanalytical ranks.
Yeah, I mean, I've studied him, and there's a video on YouTube of somebody, the analyst, sitting in the chair, and someone comes in, just has a conversation with them, and then they go, and if you look at it on a very kind of uneducated level as a psychotherapist, you might be tempted to say, well, what's all that about? But it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Kohut's self-psychology was about one regulating the other. Would I be right there?
Oh, much more to it than that. But
well,
one theme of that, I mean, yes, that's certainly a central theme. But the real theme of Kohut was, how can I explain? Was the idea of self-objects.
Yes.
And the idea that the more injury to the self, or the more disturbed the self, is mainly to do with the internalization of bad objects. In other words, the internalization of the bad other.
Yeah. Is this the kind of thing we'd hear of in Kleinian psychoanalysis?
Yeah, definitely. We're talking about object relations here. Now, Klein was probably the most famous British psychoanalyst in the the last century. And she really dealt with the young infant from 0 to 3. She was interested in the psychosis and the disturbance of the young infant, and she came up with 4 basic positions: the depressive position, and her and 3 others, which to do with psychotic positions. But she was really well known in the psychoanalytical circle in the United Kingdom. Yeah.
So object relations, I mean, that's the interesting thing in itself. And when we talk about the bad objects, what actually are we talking about as it relates to self, Bob?
The internalized other, which we see as a negative object, or negative. The object is the other, whatever the other is, the teacher, the nurse, the authoritarian figure, basically, the mother, the father, the object which has been taken on as a negative introject, part of the self which is seen as negative. So you got bad objects and you got good objects.
Yes.
So early children, of course, in their development of the self, usually split between bad and good. So they internalize bad objects as well as, in inverted commas, good objects, or the good other, or the bad other, or how they perceive the other.
Yeah. So what we have here is, as a childhood experiences, children experience good and bad. They internalize those, and those stay with them as they go through the arc of their life.
Correct.
How does that bad other impact on their kind of emotional well-being?
Well, let's borrow from TA.
Yeah.
Borrow from Gestalt psychotherapy, or borrow from some of the psychoanalytical movements. A term which I like, which is the internalized negative critic.
Oh,
So we could say bad object equals internalized negative critical. Or in other language, you could even say the negative critical parent.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Or even, as we say in the person-centered world, the introjected values and conditions of worth. It's, they all add up to the same thing. So someone has these negative self-beliefs that are transmitted through a negative person they may meet.
Absolutely. That's a good way to look at it.
That impacts on their self. And that really takes us to Hertz's kind of central idea of self-psychology, which was, Bob,
was by using empathy, by using the concept of empathy, in the actual therapeutic relationship, we can, how can I explain to you? By osmosis, by internalization, we can help the client take on what he called, and I put in brackets, good self-objects. So, in other words, the therapist, through transference, becomes the good object, and the client takes on the good self-objects, which are the antidote to the negative experiences of the client. Yeah,
which is why when I talked earlier about the YouTube video, this demonstration was basically meant to show that in the therapeutic environment, the therapist provided that good enough other, that soil of a different kind, that the client could draw from and reinforce their own sense of self. I mean, I think that producer Clarkson call it the intersubjective reparenting style. Would that be?
Yes, yeah. That's correct. And Hertz called these the transmuted other, which comes from the therapist, self-objects, or the good self-object.
Yes,
and they will go to battle, if you like, with the internalized negative object.
Yes, so it's almost like reinforcing the good sense of self and trying to rid or cleanse.
Cleanse is a better word.
Cleanse, yeah. The history and the emotions around that bad experience object, cleanse it out. And that's held in the balance of the therapeutic relationship by the use of empathy.
Absolutely. Empathy is the glue.
The glue.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. Through the empathic transactions, the self-object is transmuted or transported or transferred into the, well, quite into, but that's why I like the word osmosis, to the internal psychic of the client.
Yes.
So reparenting is a good word. I quite like that.
Yeah.
This idea of rechilding or reparenting that stands up to fight or to come alongside the negative internalized other. So I think empathy is the real glue. Hertz talked a lot about empathic transactions, and this concept of empathy is crucial to Hertz's ideas around the creation of self-objects. And he got attacked by many of the psychoanalysts who believe that empathy could lead to infantilization.
That's interesting, isn't it? So, in other words, that part of the client may not be able to actualize or grow into an adult because the reparenting style maybe of the therapist held them back. Would that be right?
Yeah, through increased empathy.
That's fascinating. I'm just thinking about this because, we come from two different traditions. I'm a person-centered therapist, the work of Rogers. You're a psychoanalyst. You come from the work of Byrne and Freud. But it's when you kind of get to the nuts and bolts of therapy, and there's not much. You can't really put too much between them. Rogers would call it the soil of a different kind.
I think here we do have the crux of one of the attacks against the humanistic movement.
Yes.
And that is the overwhelming use of empathy which may cause, from a psychoanalytical viewpoint, infantilization and a person not developing a robust adult.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because for those people, and I know we've not really discussed the book, but for those people,
no, we haven't got there yet.
We never got there yet. We get to there.
Really talking about the book.
Yeah, but for those people who watched the Gloria videos with Carl Rogers, one thing that struck me about Rogers' work, and that's kind of irked me through the years, is that almost Gloria Zamansky, who was his client, became quite infantized, and in fact, in one part of the interaction, he said he was very empathic, but he referred and made reference to a good daughter. And what's fascinating about that for me is that when they met again a year later, she asked him and his wife Helen Elliott if they'd be her surrogate parents.
Wow.
Which kind of is interesting, considering what you said about about infantizing the client.
Yeah, absolutely. So the client stays infantilized rather than growing up, or rather than, in transactional terms, developing a robust adult. Yeah. Or in fact, worse, if you'd like to, I don't know if you use the word worse, but stays adapted to the actual therapist, or as Burns stays, leaves therapy with symptomatic transference. In other words, they go away from the therapeutic process being an image of Bob Cook or Rory Lee Oakes rather than themselves.
Goodness gracious me, heaven forbid, Bob. But yeah, I think that's really, really interesting, and that I know that to be a criticism of Carl Hertz's work. So I think that's a fantastic overview of self-psychology and object relations. Mm-hmm. Moving on to the book. Theory and Practice of Self-Psychology. Yeah. What does it inform us of, Bob?
Well, it's what we're talking about, in fact, really. The idea that the therapist is that through the transference, the client can take on new self-objects. And, if you look at... Okay, let's start again. Cohert was talking in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. He died in 1982. We're now in 2017. Now, if we look at the latest neurobiology work through Shaw and some of the real pioneers of neurobiology, they talk about the plasticity of the brain and the idea that that new neurological channels can be created, which will, hover over the faulty neurological channels, if you want to put it in that word. In other words, we can grow healthy neurological channels with different changed habits of a lifetime. However, and that, I believe, this is my views, and Cohert may well have said the same thing written 50 years ago, but he didn't have the latest research about neurobiology, that the client, through the transference with the therapist, takes on or instills new self-objects. Now, that is a very small step to the idea of different neurological channels being created through the therapeutic transactions and the client's responses.
Yeah, I mean, that is really interesting, isn't it? Because there's a lot of discussion. I'm just reading Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps You Score.
That's a fantastic
book. Classic book. And one of the things that he's saying is that clients, can rewire themselves. And in fact, we know that to be true, don't we? Because if I go and learn to play the drums tomorrow and can drum a basic 4-beat, my brain is wired up to do that.
Correct. So Cohert's, before all this research on the brain, was saying the same thing. That through the therapeutic power of the relationship and what he called empathy, the client can, through the transference, internalize new self-objects, which of course is the object of the therapist, which Patricia Clarkson, in another language, will talk about in terms of reparenting.
Yeah, the repatriative style. I mean, I think what's also coming up for me here, Bob, and if anybody's watching this and is writing assignments on transference or empathy, I've always believed that transference is the conduit of empathy.
Transference. Oh, yes, yes. I agree completely. Has to be.
Yeah. It's a once you're feeling something for someone, you're actually at some level in a transference.
Of course, we have to define what transference is, but absolutely, you and I think similarly about transference. So
yes,
it isn't the subject to define transference, but I agree with you.
Mm.
It's a fascinating book, and the other thing about this book, besides talking about Cohort's ideas like we are, talks about the ideas Cohort had in terms of working with narcissism.
All right, okay.
And there's at least a chapter in this book talking about, again, about how empathy is the best way to work with narcissism, or a really good way to work with narcissism. And through the use of empathy and coming alongside the narcissistic self-world, if you like, they start treating the early developmental injuries through empathy.
Yeah, which really, narcissism, I know we've talked about this a lot, in the past, but, I think maybe we could both agree, possibly, that narcissism is due to the fact that at some point there was a lack of empathy somewhere in there.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, because narcissists come from, they're the children of narcissists.
Yes.
And narcissists lack empathy.
Yeah.
And very quickly, because I also, the other thing about Cohort, he talked about 5 major transferences.
Oh, that's interesting.
Really important pieces of work. Firstly, idealization transference, the importance of idealizing the self-other, the self-validating other. Secondly, mirroring, the importance of the mirroring transference. Thirdly, the importance of the merging transference. Fourthly, the importance of the adversarial transference, which is really twinship. And fifthly, the emergence of the mutual transference. In other words, the importance for a client to be in the journey with a therapist who's walked the similar journey as well. Yes,
so that's interesting, isn't it?
Transferences.
That's interesting, especially for our friends in the recovery world, where there's that
need for mutual transference.
Yeah, that need for mutual transference. Fascinating book. I usually ask you who should be reading this. I'm going to say everybody should be reading this because
it's quite an advanced book.
It is.
I think really, if you could find somebody who wrote more accessibly, they're fairly accessible of Cohort's works, but certainly Cohort himself really did write in a way which perhaps was a bit hard to read. So the accessible works of Cohort, these people make a start. Perhaps you need to be a 4th or 5th year student, maybe somebody who understands the concepts of transference. I mean, in a way, the more simple ideas are about self-objects, internalize the self-other, self-regulation, idealization, mirroring, twinship. But they're quite advanced concepts in a way, aren't they?
Yes, to be fair. Yes. Now you've explained it like that, Bob. Yeah, maybe 4th or 5th year students. But I think the idea of Cohort and the legacy he leaves actually links into the basis of so many models of psychotherapy.
Yeah, you're right.
So thank you so much. As always, Bob doesn't get paid for reviewing books.
No.
I'm sure he should, because they are really good book reviews. And also, if you're interested in that particular book, if you go to the comments bar downstairs, we'll put a link in. And then if you're interested in that book and you want to delve into the world of Cohort's self-psychology, click on that link. It'll take you to a bookseller who will supply it to you. And as always, Bob Cook, thank you very much.
Thank you.